That's another kick I have against the show business. It seems to make girls such darned chumps. Well, I wonder how much longer Mr. Arbuckle is going to be retrieving my mail. What ho within there! Fatty!" Mac came out, apologetic, carrying letters. "Sorry, miss. By an oversight I put you among the G's." "All's well that ends well. Put me among the G's. There's a good title for a song for you, George. Excuse me while I grapple with the correspondence. I'll bet half of these are mash notes. I got 3 between the first and second acts last night. Why the nobility and gentry of this burg should think that I am their affinity just because I've got golden hair, which is perfectly genuine, Mac, I can show you the pedigree, and because I earn an honest living singing off key is more than I can understand." Mac leaned his massive shoulders comfortably against the building and resumed his chat. "I expect you're feeling very happy today, sir?" George pondered. He was certainly feeling better since he had seen Billy Dore, but he was far from being himself. "I ought to be, I suppose, but I'm not." "Ah, you're getting blarsy, sir. That's what it is. You've had too much of the fat, you have. This piece was a big hit in America, wasn't it?" "Yes, it ran over a year in New York, and there are 3 companies of it now." "That's how it is, you see. You've gone and got blarsy. Too big a helping of success you've had." Mac wagged his head like a harvest moon. "You aren't a married man, are you, sir?" Billy Dore finished skimming through her mail and crumpled the letters up into a large ball, which she handed to Mac. "Here's something for you to read in your spare moments, Mac. Glance through them any time you have a suspicion you may be a chump, and you'll have the comfort of knowing that there are others. What were you saying about being married?" "Mr. Bevan and I was having a talk about him being blarsy, miss." "Are you blarsy, George?" "So Mac says." "And why is he blarsy, miss?" demanded Mac rhetorically. "Well, don't ask me," said Billy. "It's not my fault." "It's because, as I was saying, 'e's had too big an helping of success, and because he ain't a married man. You did say you wasn't a married man, didn't you, sir?" "I didn't, but I'm not." "That's how it is, you see. You pretty soon get sick of pulling off good things if you ain't got nobody to pat you on the back for doing it. Why, when I was single, if I got hold of a sure thing for a 3 o'clock race and picked up a couple of quid, the thrill of it didn't seem to linger somehow. But now, if some of the gentlemen that come here put me on to something safe and I make a bit of the fascination of it, taking the stuff home and rolling it on the kitchen table and having her pat me on the back." "You seem to understand the art of being happy, Mac." "It ain't an art, sir. It's just getting hold of the right little woman and having a nice little home of your own to go back to at night." "Mac," said Billy admiringly, "you talk like a Tin Pan Alley song hit, except that you've left out the scent of honeysuckle and old Mr. Moon climbing up over the trees. Well, you're quite right. I'm all for the simple and domestic life. If I could find the right and he didn't see me coming and duck, I'd become one of the Mendelssohn's March daughters right away. Are you going, George? There's a rehearsal at 2:30 for cuts. I want to get the evening papers and send off a cable or 2. See you later. We shall meet at Philippi." Mac eyed George's retreating back till he had turned the corner. "Nice, pleasant gentleman, Mr. Bevan," he said. "Too bad he's got the pip the way he has, just after having a big success like this here. Comes of being an artist, I suppose." Miss Dore dived into her vanity case and produced a puff with which she proceeded to powder her nose. "All composers are nuts, Mac. I was in a show once where the manager was panning the composer because there wasn't a number in the score that had a tune to it. Well, the poor geek admitted they weren't very tuney, but he said the thing about his music was that it had such a wonderful aroma. They all get that way. The jazz seems to go to their heads. George is all right, though, and don't let anyone tell you different." "How long have you known him, miss?" "About 5 years. I was a stenographer in the house that published his songs when I first met him. And there's another thing you've got to hand it to George for. He hasn't let success give him a swelled head. The money that boy makes is sinful, Mac. He wears $1,000 bills next to his skin winter and summer, but he's just the same as he was when I first knew him, when he was just hanging around Broadway, looking out for a chance to be allowed to slip a couple of interpolated numbers into any old show that came along. Yes, put it in your diary, Mac, and write it on your cuff. George Bevan's all right. He's an ace." Unconscious of these eulogies which, coming from one whose judgment he respected, might have cheered him up, George wandered down Shaftesbury Avenue feeling more depressed than ever. The sun had gone in for the time being, and the east wind was frolicking round him like a playful puppy, patting him with a cold paw, nuzzling his ankles, bounding away and bounding back again, and behaving generally as east winds do when they discover a victim who has come out without his spring overcoat. It was plain to George now that the sun and the wind were a couple of confidence tricksters working together as a team. The sun had disarmed him with specious promises and an air of cheery good fellowship, and had delivered him into the hands of the wind, which was now going through him with the swift thoroughness of the professional hold-up artist. He quickened his steps and began to wonder if he was so sunk in senile decay as to have acquired a liver. He discarded the theory as repellent, and yet there must be a reason for his depression. Today of all days, as Mac had pointed out, he had everything to make him happy. Popular as he was in America, this was the first piece of his to be produced in London, and there was no doubt that it was a success of unusual dimensions. And yet he felt no elation. He reached Piccadilly and turned westwards, and then, as he passed the gates of the In and Out Club, he had a moment of clear vision and understood everything. He was depressed because he was bored, and he was bored because he was lonely. Mac, that solid thinker, had been right. The solution of the problem of life was to get hold of the right girl and have a home to go back to at night. He was mildly surprised that he had tried in any other direction for an explanation of his gloom. It was all the more inexplicable in that fully 80% of the lyrics which he had set in the course of his musical comedy career had had that thought at the back of them. George gave himself up to an orgy of sentimentality. He seemed to be alone in the world, which had paired itself off into a sort of seething welter of happy couples. Taxicabs full of happy couples rolled by every minute. Passing omnibuses creaked beneath the weight of happy couples. The very policeman across the street had just grinned at a flitting shop-girl, and she had smiled back at him. The only female in London who did not appear to be attached was a girl in brown who was coming along the sidewalk at a leisurely pace, looking about her in a manner that suggested that she found Piccadilly a new and stimulating spectacle. As far as George could see, she was an extremely pretty girl, small and dainty, with a proud little tilt to her head and a jaunty walk that spoke of perfect health. She was, in fact, precisely the sort of girl that George felt he could love with all the stored-up devotion of an old buffer of 27 who had squandered none of his rich nature in foolish flirtations. He had just begun to weave a rose-tinted romance with their two selves when a cold reaction set in. Even as he paused to watch the girl threading her way through the crowd, the east wind jabbed an icy finger down the back of his neck, and the chill of it sobered him. After all, he reflected bitterly, this girl was only alone because she was on her way somewhere to meet some confounded man. Besides, there was no earthly chance of getting to know her. You can't rush up to pretty girls in the street and tell them you are lonely. At least you can, but it doesn't get you anywhere except the police station. George's gloom deepened, a thing he would not have believed possible a moment before. He felt that he had been born too late. The restraints of modern civilization irked him. It was not, he told himself, like this in the good old days. In medieval ages, for example, this girl would have been a damsel. And in that happy time practically everybody whose technical rating was that of damsel was in distress and only too willing to waive the formalities in return for services rendered by the casual passer-by. But the 20th century was a prosaic age when girls are merely girls and have no troubles at all. Were he to stop this girl in brown and assure her that his aid and comfort were at her disposal, she would undoubtedly call that large policeman from across the way, and the romance would begin and end within the space of 30 seconds. Or, if the policeman were a quick mover, rather less. Better to dismiss dreams and return to the practical side of life by buying the evening papers from the shabby individual beside him who had just thrust an early edition into his face. After all, notices are notices, even when the heart is aching. George felt in his pocket for the necessary money, found emptiness, and remembered that he had left all his ready funds at his hotel. It was just one of the things he might have expected on a day like this. The man with the papers had the air of one whose business is conducted on purely cash principles. There was only one thing to be done: return to the hotel, retrieve his money, and try to forget the weight of the world and its cares in lunch. And from the hotel he could dispatch the 2 or 3 cables which he wanted to send to New York. The girl in brown was quite close now, and George was enabled to get a clearer glimpse of her. She more than fulfilled the promise she had given him at a distance. Had she been constructed to his own specifications, she would not have been more acceptable in George's sight. And now she was going out of his life for ever. With an overwhelming sense of pathos, for there is no pathos more bitter than that of parting from someone we have never met, George hailed a taxicab which crawled to the side of the road, and, with all the refrains of all the sentimental song hits he had ever composed ringing in his ears, he got in and passed away. A rotten world, he mused as the cab, after proceeding a couple of yards, came to a standstill in a block of traffic. A dull, flat bore of a world in which nothing happens or ever will happen. Even when you take a cab, it just sticks and doesn't move. At this point the door of the cab opened and the girl in brown jumped in. "I am so sorry," she said breathlessly, "but would you mind hiding me, please?" End of chapter 2.